I want to begin with a number 1820, according to modern history books. That is the year Antarctica was first discovered. Sometimes historians phrase it more carefully. They say it was the first time the continent was officially sighted, recorded, or documented. Either way, 1820 is the date that appears again and again in textbooks, timelines, and encyclopedias. For most of my life, I accepted that date without hesitation. It seemed like one of those basic historical facts you absorb in school and never think to question. After all, why would you? It's written everywhere, but at some point I began looking more closely at the timeline, and once I started paying attention to the dates surrounding 1820, I found it impossible to stop before going further. I need to briefly revisit something from the previous part of this series. If you've been following along, you'll remember we discussed the event historians call the year without a summer. That year was 1816, according to the official explanation. The strange global climate of 1816 was caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia the year before. The eruption was an enormous, one of the most powerful volcanic events in recorded history. It reportedly sent massive amounts of ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and lowering global temperatures. The result was dramatic. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere. Snow fell in June in parts of North America. Europe experienced severe famine. Livestock died in huge numbers. Even summer skies reportedly appeared strange, filled with orange and purple sunsets, caused by volcanic particles in the air. On paper, the explanation seems neat and tidy. Volcano erupts, gives ash enters atmosphere, gives temperatures drop, gives crops fail. But when you start examining historical reports from the time, the situation begins to look less simple. The unusual weather patterns were not just regional, they were global. Reports of extreme cold appeared across vast distances at roughly the same time. Snow in June in New England. Frozen harvests in Europe. Abnormal skies across continents. It wasn't just environmental disruption either, the years immediately following. 1816 saw widespread social upheaval. Populations moved. Economies struggled. Entire communities seemed to lose continuity with what had existed before. One researcher described this period, using a striking phrase, civilizational amnesia. The idea suggests that something more than a simple climate anomaly might have occurred. Something that disrupted not only agriculture and weather patterns, but also the continuity of societies themselves. In the previous video, I explored a controversial possibility that the atmospheric disruption of 1816 might not have been purely volcanic, that it may have resembled something closer to what we would today describe as a nuclear winter-like effect, a sudden atmospheric blackout capable of triggering global collapse. To be clear, this is not a confirmed theory. It's a question, a hypothesis that some researchers connect with the controversial idea that a sophisticated global civilization may have existed before the 19th century, Civilization sometimes referred to, somewhat loosely, as Tartaria. This idea proposes that before the modern era there may have been a highly advanced network of societies, spread across continents, leaving behind mysterious architecture, city layouts that appear suddenly in historical records, and infrastructure whose construction history is surprisingly unclear. Whether one accepts that idea or not, one detail in the timeline continues to stand out: the year 1816, a global atmospheric crisis. And then 4 years later, in 1820, the official discovery of Antarctica, the most remote and frozen landmass on Earth. That 4-year gap is where the questions begin. Keep that gap in mind for a moment. 1816. The world experiences what may be the most unusual climate disaster in recorded history. Crops fail, temperatures plunge, and societies across the northern hemisphere struggle to recover. That only 4 years later, in 1820, the largest unexplored landmass on Earth is suddenly discovered. And not by one expedition, by 3 different ones. Historical records tell us that in the same year, within roughly the same period of time, 3 separate groups reported sightings of the Antarctic continent. A Russian expedition led by Fabian von Bellingshausen, a British expedition, and an American sealing captain, Nathaniel Palmer, all appear in the historical timeline as early observers of Antarctica. Official history treats this as coincidence. Competition between maritime powers often produced overlapping discoveries. Sailors explored aggressively during that era, pushing further into unknown waters. But the timing still raises a fascinating question: why 1820? Human civilization had already produced advanced maritime cultures for thousands of years. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, the Polynesian navigators all were capable sailors who explored enormous distances across open oceans. Later came the age of exploration in the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries. European powers circumnavigated the globe. They mapped continents, crossed oceans, and charted remote islands. Yet somehow, the largest landmass in the southern hemisphere remained officially undiscovered until the early 19th century, and that's where the historical record begins to get strange, because when researchers dig into older cartographic archives, they sometimes encounter maps that appear to contradict the official timeline. One of the most famous examples is the Piri Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis. What makes this map remarkable is not just its age. It is the source material that Piri Reis himself described. According to notes written on the map, he compiled it using much older charts, some of which reportedly dated back centuries, and the southern portion of the map appears to show something unexpected, a landmass resembling Antarctica, not just a vague southern continent either. Some interpretations suggest the coastline resembles the actual shape of Antarctica's land beneath its massive ice sheets. Decades later, another map appeared, this one created by the French cartographer Orens-Fine in 1531. This map also depicts a southern continent, but it goes even further. The landmass shown includes mountains, rivers, and geographic features that resemble structures later discovered beneath Antarctica's ice using modern radar and sonar technology. Let that sink in for a moment. A map drawn in the 16th century appears to show geographic details of Antarctica that modern scientists only confirmed centuries later. Naturally, historians offer explanations for this. Some suggest that early cartographers simply believed a southern continent must exist for the sake of geographical symmetry, a theoretical landmass balancing the continents in the north. Others argue the maps are misinterpreted, or that the shapes resemble Antarctica only by coincidence. Those explanations may be correct, but they still leave an uncomfortable question lingering in the background. How did early mapmakers draw coastlines and interior features that appear surprisingly accurate when compared with modern satellite data? Cartographers don't normally guess rivers. They don't invent mountain ranges with the correct orientation by accident. They usually draw what they believe someone has seen, which leads to the obvious question: if Antarctica appeared on maps centuries before its official discovery, then who originally mapped it? And just as importantly, when? Because if the maps were copied from even older sources, as Piri Reis himself claimed, then somewhere in the distant past there must have been explorers with knowledge of lands far beyond what conventional history currently recognizes, and that possibility brings us back to the strange timing surrounding the year 1816. Let's return for a moment to 1816. In the previous discussion, I framed that year as a possible ending, the moment when a global atmospheric catastrophe disrupted climate systems and triggered widespread hardship across the northern hemisphere. But what if that framing is only half the story? What if 1816 wasn't just the end of something? What if it was also the beginning of something new? Consider this carefully. If a massive atmospheric disruption truly occurred, whether volcanic, environmental, or something more complex, it might not only have cooled the northern continents. It could also have affected the polar regions in dramatic ways. Some researchers have speculated about a possibility that is rarely discussed in mainstream historical narratives: that the same climatic forces which caused freezing temperatures across Europe and North America might also have accelerated glaciation at the poles. In simple terms, the theory asks a provocative question. What if Antarctica was not always covered by the vast ice sheets we see today? Modern science tells us Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years. Yet the old maps from the 1500s appear to show a coastline that resembles Antarctica without ice, including interior geographic features that lie beneath kilometers of frozen layers today. To be clear, this does not prove that Antarctica was recently ice-free. Most scientists reject that interpretation, but the existence of those maps still raises an intriguing historical puzzle. If early cartographers were copying from older sources, as Piri Reis himself claimed, then those earlier sources would have required knowledge of the continent's shape long before the official discovery in 1820, and that brings us back to the strange pattern in the timeline. 1816. Global atmospheric event disrupts climate across the world. 1820. Antarctica is suddenly discovered by multiple expeditions. Seen through that lens, the discovery begins to look less like a random moment and more like the opening of a new chapter. The timeline becomes even more interesting when we jump forward more than a century. In 1946, just 1 year after the end of World War II, the United States launched one of the largest Antarctic expeditions in history. It was called Operation High Jump. This was not a small scientific mission. It was a massive military operation led by Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, one of the most famous polar explorers of the 20th century. The expedition included 13 ships, 33 aircraft, nearly 5,000 military personnel. Official goal was to train military forces for operations in extreme cold environments and to conduct scientific mapping of Antarctica on the surface. That explanation makes sense. After World War II, the United States was interested in understanding how military equipment and personnel would function in polar climates, but the scale of the mission still stands out. Few scientific expeditions require thousands of soldiers and an entire naval task force, and the United States was not the first nation to take a sudden interest in Antarctica during that period. Several years earlier, in 1938, Nazi Germany launched its own Antarctic expedition. The mission explored an area now known as Neuschwabenland, mapping hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of territory. Aircraft dropped thousands of markers across the ice in an attempt to claim the region. What the German expedition discovered is still debated. The surviving records are incomplete, but historians know that German submarines were documented operating in Antarctic waters even toward the end of World War I. Why so many powerful nations suddenly focused attention on the most remote continent on Earth is still a question historians continue to discuss, and this leads us to an even bigger development that happened only a few years later. In 1959, something unusual happened in global politics. At the height of the Cold War, when nations around the world were divided by ideology, military alliances, and nuclear rivalry, an unexpected agreement emerged. It was called the Antarctic Treaty. 12 countries originally signed it, and today more than 50 nations participate in the treaty system. The agreement established Antarctica as a scientific preserve and placed strict limitations on how the continent could be used. According to the treaty, Antarctica is dedicated to peaceful scientific research. Military activity, nuclear testing, and mineral extraction are prohibited. Territorial claims are essentially frozen in place, and cooperation between nations is encouraged. On the surface, this sounds like a positive achievement for humanity, a rare example of global cooperation focused on science and environmental protection. But there is an interesting detail that often goes unnoticed. Countries rarely agree on anything. Throughout the 20th century and even today, nations argue about borders, resources, ideology, trade, and territory. Wars have been fought over far smaller pieces of land than Antarctica, yet on this one subject, a massive continent covering nearly 14 million square kilometers, dozens of countries reached a lasting agreement, and they have maintained that agreement for decades. The treaty does not technically forbid people from visiting Antarctica. Scientific teams work there year-round, and limited tourism is allowed along certain coastal areas, but in practice, independent exploration of the interior is extremely difficult. Travel to Antarctica requires logistical support, permits, specialized equipment, and coordination with national programs. Without that support, reaching the interior of the continent is almost impossible for an ordinary individual. In other words, Antarctica remains one of the least accessible places on Earth. For comparison, think about the rest of the planet. People climb Mount Everest recreationally. Explorers cross the Sahara Desert. Sailors reach remote islands thousands of kilometers from civilization. Adventurers trek through dense jungles and unexplored mountain ranges. Yet Antarctica, the largest wilderness on Earth, remains heavily regulated and largely unexplored by the general public. Most people accept this without question. After all, Antarctica is an extreme environment. Temperatures can drop below 60 degrees Celsius. Storms can last for days. The landscape is dangerous and inhospitable. So, the restrictions seem reasonable, but when you combine that fact with the historical timeline, some observers begin to wonder if there might be more to the story. Think about the sequence again. Ancient maps appear to show Antarctica centuries before its official discovery. A massive global atmospheric disruption occurs in 1816. 4 years later, the continent is suddenly discovered. During the mid-20th century, powerful nations launch major expeditions to explore it. Then an international treaty effectively places the entire continent under controlled access. None of these facts alone proves anything unusual, but together they create a pattern that many researchers find difficult to ignore. And the mystery deepens when we look at another puzzle connected to the controversial Tartaria hypothesis, the question of unexplained architecture around the world. To understand why Antarctica sometimes appears in discussions about the Tartaria hypothesis, we have to look at another puzzle that researchers often point to: the existence of massive architectural structures across the world that seem far more advanced than the official historical timeline might suggest. Throughout Europe, Asia, and the Americas, there are enormous stone buildings, cathedrals, fortresses, and civic structures built with astonishing precision. Many of them appeared during periods when construction technology was supposedly limited: cathedrals with towering domes and intricate stonework, government buildings with vast columns and complex foundations, railway stations and exhibition halls from the 19th century that look more like the achievements of a lost golden age than the early steps of industrial society. Historians explain these structures through the development of architecture during the Renaissance, Baroque, and neoclassical periods. Skilled craftsmen, long construction timelines, and large labor forces made these achievements possible, and in most cases, those explanations are convincing. Yet some researchers believe there are still unanswered questions, particularly when examining how quickly certain cities appeared to grow during the 18th and 19th centuries. Entire districts filled with monumental stone buildings seem to appear almost simultaneously in historical records. Photographs from the mid-1800s sometimes show vast cities that appear strangely empty, as if they had been built before the population arrived. One explanation is simple: early photography required long exposure times, meaning moving people often didn't appear in images. Another explanation is that rapid urban development during the industrial era created cities faster than populations could fill them, but alternative researchers propose a different idea. They suggest that many of these buildings may not have been originally constructed by the societies that later occupied them. Instead, they argue these structures could be remnants of a much older global civilization, a civilization sometimes referred to in alternative history discussions as Tartaria. According to this theory, That civilization may have collapsed during a series of global disruptions sometime before the 19th century. The survivors inherited fragments of its infrastructure without fully understanding how it had been built. This idea remains highly controversial. Most historians reject it because the archaeological evidence supporting it is limited, but the reason Antarctica enters the conversation is simple. If a sophisticated civilization once existed and later disappeared from the historical record, where would traces of it remain? Some researchers speculate that Antarctica, isolated, frozen, and largely unexplored, could theoretically hide evidence of ancient structures or lost knowledge beneath kilometers of ice. Modern radar technology has indeed revealed subglacial mountain ranges, lakes, and valleys buried deep beneath Antarctica's ice sheet. These discoveries show that the continent hides an enormous landscape that humans have never directly seen. However, no confirmed archaeological structures have ever been discovered there. Still, the combination of strange maps, sudden historical discoveries, unexplored territory, and controversial historical gaps continues to fuel curiosity, and perhaps that curiosity is the real point. History is not a finished book. It is a constantly evolving investigation, shaped by new discoveries, better technology, and fresh questions. About the past, Antarctica remains one of the last great frontiers on Earth, a continent larger than Europe that humanity has barely begun to study. What lies beneath its miles-thick ice sheet may simply be mountains and ancient geological formations, or it may hold clues about chapters of Earth's past that we have not yet fully understood. Until we know more, the story remains open. And sometimes the most important step in understanding history is simply being willing to ask the questions others forgot to ask.